We'll start slowly. I hear that the tradition is that people trickle in along the way. Thank you for being here. I know that there are a lot of people have gotten really used to Zoom. So I'm assuming that a lot of people who registered for the event are also going to either think it was on Zoom or they're going to be following on Zoom. We will be recording the event. So for those who are not here in person, it'll be a great opportunity to catch up later on. So I'll change glasses because I need to actually read some introductory remarks. Now, welcome to 19 Washington Square North, which is the intellectual center and the home of NYU Abu Dhabi here in New York. Over the academic year, 19 is host to many different activities, including lectures, conferences, exhibitions, and their openings. And it also serves as a meeting space for students and faculty and the members of the public to interact and learn. The NYU Abu Dhabi Institute in particular organizes many of the activities here that offer the Washington Square community opportunities to hear experts talk about their research and its societal relevance, technological and cultural impact, and importance for the world at large. Which brings us to today. So my name is Sofia Kalantzakos. I am a Global Distinguished Professor of Environmental Studies and Public Policy at New York University in Abu Dhabi. And we're here today to talk a little bit about the path to net zero. As most of you probably know in the room, Abu Dhabi will be, or rather the UAE, will be hosting COP28 in December. And there's a lot of conversation about how are we moving to this path to achieve net zero in time. I mean, there's a lot to talk about this, but I just want to tell you a little bit about the project that we worked on a few years ago. I had a fellowship at Caltech in the Huntington. And the project I was working on was about the critical minerals and the decarbonization and digitalization of the global economy. So one of the things that was missing in the literature, I think, and in the public space was a real conversation, not only amongst academics about what does it mean to try to decarbonize and green the global economy, but have a conversation between the academy, also industry, people from the financial sector. So we wanted to have multiple stakeholders involved and have this conversation. Out of this collaboration, we put together a cohort. We're not all here today who participated in this particular project, which is a book project called Critical Minerals, the Climate Crisis, and the Tech Imperium. It was published in this spring, late spring, by Springer. All of us brought in a different perspective about what this transition means, what are the materials that we need, but also the geopolitics surrounding this transition. I want to backtrack a little to say the following. A few years ago, in 2018, you would think it's ancient history, I wrote a book called China and the Geopolitics of Rare Earths. And I think it was one of the first books that was written about that. And I was pointing out that China really had the upper hand in not only in the production of the materials themselves, but also in the entire supply chains, the global supply chains. And that I thought that this is a very big geopolitical issue and that Europe, the United States, and other industrial nations should really start paying attention as to how they can diversify their supply chains. And in fact, the reason I turned my own attention to this problem was because in 2010, we had an unofficial embargo of rare earths to Japan, which is one of the leading technological countries of the world. And all of the major industrial nations became very frantic about, oh, what's going to happen with this? And so there was a lot of talk and a lot of activity and a lot of conferencing and exchanges. But in reality, once the prices corrected themselves and the market came back into play, nobody was disputing that globalization could not provide a solution to this issue. And in fact, when I started my work there, And Kristin will tell us also, because she is one of the other leading scholars in this field, people were dismissing it as a blip. So fast forward in like the last couple of years, geopolitics have become incredibly contentious and fraught. So we're facing a major shift in the global economy, plus an accelerated climate crisis, because I just want to remind the audience that we're supposed to be decarbonizing the economy as one of our responses to the climate crisis. It's turned into an industrial plan, of course, but the reason for this was we really wanted to reduce emissions. And this was, once it made economic sense, it became the vehicle by which we could show and prove that this was a way of reducing at least our emissions footprint, and provide some solutions to the accelerating climate crisis. So we've seen that we're now facing a new situation, a hyper competition between the US and China. Of course, now we're seeing that the politics are so fraught, and it's not only the US and China. Recent events in the Ukraine and now in the Middle East are showing how precarious pieces and how contention is really building up in the world order. And so this is something that's very very alarming, but this is the way that things are. So we really wanted to turn our attention to what it will mean in this climate of fraught geopolitics to try to really accelerate this energy and digital transmission. So we brought in, as I said, different experts. Then we all produced chapters for this particular volume. Each one of us today will talk a little bit about their point of view. I will start with Constantine Karayannopoulos, who was until very recently the CEO of Neo Materials. And I love the chapter that he and Vasilios authored together, because of course he'll tell you it's really not about geopolitics, it's all about economics. So all by way of saying that in this volume, we do bring together different points of view, because we think that it is a discussion really worth having. And this idea of use of economic statecraft and resource competition, and the way that now there's this narrative, a framework of decoupling, and how globalization now is being questioned as a path forward. I think these are issues that we put on the table. One last thing before I act more as a moderator than actually as a presenter, is to say that critical minerals that are absolutely essential for the decarbonization and digitalization of the global economy have their own issues. And a lot of these are environmental concerns. And we do have chapters in our book that address these issues about the environmental implications of all of this mining, that it has to happen. I mean, there are many, and Owen Pell will talk to us a lot about how ESG standards may help, how would I say it, address a lot of these tremendous impacts that increased mining and this material intensity of our transition requires. But we'd like to hear from everyone as we, debating all of these different aspects. So I'll start. I want to thank everybody and all the other authors. I don't know if you had an opportunity to pick up a flyer that talks about all the different authors in the book, but I'd like to start with Constantine and ask him to tell us, because he's a veteran in the rare earths industry. And for how many was it, 30 or 40? I don't want to add years to your age. Okay, 30 years in the rare earth trenches, having worked with China, having worked in, starting in Canada, working with Europe. Tell us a little bit about your experience.
We'll do so, yeah, thank you, Sophia. Sophia just called me old, so a veteran, yeah. wise perhaps is a better description. I hope I live up to it. But yeah, we started our company in 1993, 94. We bought controlling interest in 2 plants in China, and then we kept growing after that. So we've had a front row seat in China's development, but also on the geopolitics of rare earths that and critical materials that as we go on, they're becoming more and more intense. So I guess one of the points, one of the questions you asked me to address is how did supply chains evolve into what we see today? But before we get into that, let me make some high level points on why critical minerals, in my view at least, are worth spending so much time and effort trying to understand. And that's, if we believe in climate change, then we better do something about it, and we better do it fast. I'm sure there are folks that do not believe that climate change is real. Perhaps it's a hoax, but as a self-respecting chemical engineer, I would beg to disagree. So we'll leave that at that. So if we believe in the need to lessen what levels of CO2 we emit and what other greenhouse gases we emit, there's always, I think, I like to think in mathematical terms, and there's the sort of production, the generation of CO2, and then there's the consumption, or rather in equivalent terms, there's energy that's produced, and that's a big producer of a generator of CO2. And then when energy is consumed, we produce more CO2. So in my mind, there's either we reduce the amount of energy that we produce, but then the logical consequence of that thought is that, well, we all end up, back living the way our parents and grandparents used to live, or even before that, and we consume less. And one of the ways you can consume less is by having much more efficient electric motors. A good friend of mine in Denmark has calculated that 10% of the world's energy is consumed in moving water around, which is phenomenal. So if we could only come up with, more efficient ways to do things, to do work, then we could consume a lot less energy. And there's no more efficient electric motors today than electric motors that are driven with rare earth magnets. And that's what you see in 99% of the electric vehicles in the world. And for the next decade or 2 decades, I really don't see any technologies out there that would reduce the need for rare earths as the world continues to move towards electric vehicles and more energy efficient motors. So I guess this is a long way of saying that if we are going to make a difference in managing climate change, then energy consumption is a big part of that equation. And we need to continue to have technology help us get to the solution. Technology by itself is not going to do it, but every sort of initiative has a role to play, and better technologies that use critical minerals, whether it's lithium for batteries or rare earths for electric motors. I think these are all parts of a puzzle that, unless we precisely put it together, we're going to continue to get into more and more trouble. So rare earths, in my view, are indispensable to the path towards net zero, the subject of our chat. So now, this is a realization that has become part of the narrative in the last decade, when climate change has become a lot more something that needs to be dealt with a lot more urgently. But the supply chains, the way they behaved over the last 3 decades, at least 4 decades, 3 or 4. At least I've been working for 4 decades, but in rare earths, it's been 3 decades. It has been a development of where that has been dominated by the rise of China as the workshop of the world, as a major industrial power. You choose your epithet, and China all of a sudden, if we haven't, for those who haven't been paying attention, we wake up one day and China dominates the world of rare earths. Well, it didn't happen by accident. It was planned. It was deliberate. And it was an absolutely rational outcome of Chinese universities, the Chinese Academy of Sciences, the various ministries spending a lot of money on R&D, developing technologies, developing production technologies, as well as application technologies. And they realized way before everybody else that perhaps this is, again, a piece of the puzzle that they needed in order to continue to develop their economy. And I recall in the 90s, I was there, I was involved with these types of discussions, how the state, centrally planned economy notwithstanding, but the state had a big role to play in the development of how rare earths are extracted, but also how they're used. And that became a small part of a very large machine in China on how the economy developed. Fast forward to 2010, it took the rest of the world a couple of decades at least to catch up. During all this development, what happened is when we set up our plants in China in the 90s, the original business plan was to produce in China because China had some tremendous advantages, and it wasn't labor costs, it wasn't environmental, lax environmental standards, and we can get into that if you'd like. China was becoming the workshop of the world. So we built our plants and we're supplying all of our customers in the West. The domestic market in China was meaningless. 90% of what we're producing, we're exporting to Japan, United States, and Europe. The following decade, though, was a massive shift. It's when supply chains started moving to China in order to address this massively expanding middle class in China. So all of a sudden, BASF, Umicore, General Motors, Ford, and so on, all of these customers that we were supplying around the world, they were building their biggest plants in China. And as a result, they insisted that we expand our production capacity for the domestic market. And if you know anything about supply chains, well, where your customers go, you have to go. So when GM moves to Shanghai, well, their tier one suppliers move to Shanghai, their tier two suppliers move nearby, and so on and so forth. So during the 2000 to 2010 period, we saw a very, very significant migration of supply chains. It wasn't just building one plant in China, it was supply chains picking up and moving because that's what made sense for them. So again, in my view, what has happened with supply chains up until geopolitics became a hot topic, it was strictly economics. Go back to Michael Porter's book, The Competitive Advantage of Nations. He's talked about how things develop. You have this massive customer pull that forces you and your suppliers and their suppliers and their suppliers to coordinate in order to optimize your offerings to your most important customers. Inside the company, I used to say, boys and girls, if Umicore or General Motors decides to build a plant on the moon, well, guess what? We're going to the moon. There's no ifs, ands, or buts. I mean, you have to go where your customers need you to be. Otherwise, bad things happen. So the early part of the supply chain re-establishment had nothing to do with geopolitics. Perhaps China being ahead of anyone else in terms of having the need to create an economy to feed the continuous growth of its middle class was ahead of everybody else as a result. But this worked for China. In other words, the Chinese government and China as a country did what they had to do in order to develop their economy and feed their people. I think the onus had to be on Japan, Europe, and North America on how to react to that effect. And it was only in 2010 when the embargo happened, which, I remember this caused quite a bit of a debate during the presentations and before the book was written as to whether it was official, it was unofficial, what it was. But it also, that event, if anything, pointed to the weakness of how the rest of the world addressed the issue of critical minerals. And that's when people, all of a sudden they wake up one morning and say, good Lord, what's going on here? We need to do more of this. So, I'll stop talking here because I will lose my voice soon. So I think taking this to the next stage, if we're really serious, I'll recap. If we're really serious about dealing with global warming, we need critical minerals, no ifs, ands, or buts, for all kinds of technologies that will allow us to decarbonize faster and reduce our carbon footprint. However, critical minerals don't come out of thin air. Either they come out of the ground or the ones in circulation perhaps can be recycled. Recycling, again, one of my pet peeves, recycling will have to be a necessary part of the total solution. It cannot be the solution. It just isn't enough to go around. And we also, as a self-respecting chemical engineer for whom thermodynamics was one of my favorite subjects, sometimes recycling has a much bigger carbon footprint than digging fresh stuff out of the ground. So mining is a necessary evil, or I wouldn't call it evil, perhaps it shouldn't be taken out of context, but it is necessary. And I'm looking forward to your comments about how ESG, because I've been saying this all along in our company. And in fact, Vasilios has written our first sustainability report, and we keep spending a lot of time and effort and money on this, and it's the only way to go. But mining will continue. We will need to continue to extract critical minerals out of the crust of the earth. And hopefully we can do a much better job at it as we go along. I'll stop there.
Okay, just to give a little bit of context for those who may not be following closely what happened in Japan in 2010. Do you want to talk about that? Okay, then. So Kristin and Vekasi will talk about this, but I just want to reframe a little and say a couple of things. The first thing is that the first takeaway is whether what China did to build its own capacity in critical minerals and in the production of vehicles, because they have put a lot of emphasis on the electrification of transport at a time when Europe was doing diesel and the United States basically wasn't doing anything with the exception of Tesla. They found a niche market in order and invested heavily there. Now, how this became also part of the geopolitical narrative of how China was somehow had this plan to outcompete the West is also part of what we've been talking about, and we really want to address, because there's so much out there that really misses some of the details as to how we got to where we got. So, Kristin.
Yes, absolutely. And thank you so much for having me here today. And the contributions to this book are really quite fabulous. And I do strongly recommend those of you in the audience to check out the book and see all of the different perspectives that are in there. And some of those are on this panel, and then there are others as well that are not here. So I in my work and my research largely focus on the approaches of countries in Northeast Asia on supply chain issues. So I do a lot of work in Japan, China, South Korea, largely. But in many ways, my home academic approach comes from Japan. But in 2009, I was in Northeastern China, studying with a Chinese economist at the Harbin Institute of Technology. And she told me, what you need to do is you need to really focus on rare earths. Like just start learning, focus right there. And I was like, okay, I'll do that. Wow, this is pretty interesting. So in 2009, I start to do that. And I start to notice in 2009, and this is really important, that Japan, in particular, the Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry, this is their economic planning bureaucracy, has started to look at rare earths as a potential place where Japan, the Japanese government, might want to pay a little bit more attention. And they start to develop some industrial policy. Now, it's not very vigorous industrial policy at this point. The next year in 2010, I'm spending some years in Tokyo doing research, and this event happens. There's a clash of a fishing boat with a Japanese Coast Guard outside of territorial waters, of contested territorial waters around the Senkaku or Diaoyu Islands in the East China Sea. The Japanese Coast Guard arrests the captain and the crew. There is a big to-do about this, and in the midst of this, Japanese companies start telling the government, we can no longer buy rare earths. We can't load them onto ships. The Chinese government denies that there's an embargo. This is something that many groups of people have debated. I don't think we need to do that today, because what's important to what happens next is that Japanese companies and the Japanese state react as if there was an embargo. They take it as they have a very heightened risk and start to see these things like supply chain choke points, trade choke points, places where you can't quickly find a substitute for a critical input for a product, something that maybe should be a state priority. And indeed, the Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry, in conjunction with some Japanese groups, such as the Japan Oil, Gas and Metals Corporation, JOGMEC, start to fund recycling, start to fund research efforts into substitution technologies, and also start to fund efforts into diversification. So in 2010, Japan really starts to pursue diversification efforts for rare earths specifically. Over the last 13 years, these efforts have continued. There have been lots of waves of funding for companies to try and do some exploratory work, setting up either new mining ventures and also processing plants for rare earths. And they've also started to branch out into other critical minerals, of which Japan, like the United States, now has a long, healthy list. Japan does not yet match the 50 minerals that are on the US list, but it's around 40 right now. It's getting close. And remarkably, Japan has some success in their diversification efforts. So they go from getting over 90% of rare earths from China to down to about 60%. And that number goes up and down a little bit, but they work with a number of different countries, particularly setting up a non-Chinese supply chain with Australia, Malaysia. They have a lot of sort of newer projects that are happening in Vietnam, and they also have a very long list, a longer list of projects that have not worked out. And this is also a really important point. In particular, there have been projects in Mongolia, in Kazakhstan, in Canada, in the United States, in South Africa, in other places as well. We have a global array of projects that started and then didn't go anywhere and don't seem to be, won't be restarted. These high rates of failure are really quite typical, in fact. Most projects that are started don't end up bringing things to market within 10 years, often within 2 decades. And this is not a story that government policymakers like to hear, right? That, oh, so we'd like you to subsidize this project, offer things to private companies in order to get these critical minerals that we need for the race to net zero, but also for, to keep up with the latest advanced technology. Most of them will fail, and that taxpayer money will be going to projects that don't have an output. This is an unpleasant story for elected politicians. It's also an unpleasant story for technocrats, for bureaucrats. Remember speaking with a Minister of Finance bureaucrat from Japan, that he had been in charge of the budgeting for this project. And we were discussing my work, and I told him about the supply chain and the difficulties and the various environmental problems and the social problems, and how people don't want these projects in their backyards. And he said, oh, he didn't know any of that context. He's just like, why don't we just scrap this whole thing? These are very, very poor rates of success. I as the person in charge of the checkbook, want to stop it. I think maybe they got a second life after that. I'm not sure. But Japan has these tools of industrial policy that they've been using now for almost a decade and a half with some success. South Korea has also been pursuing somewhat similar projects that I'd be happy to talk about in a little bit more detail if folks are interested later. One of the things that I think is really important, and this is one of my big takeaways, is that Japan and South Korea as well have found a really key partner in pursuing the diversification of supply chains in critical minerals, and their key partner is Australia. And Australia is certainly rich in resources, and there are a lot of rare earth mining there, but they're also rich in technical expertise. And Australia also has more, compared to some of the alternatives, accountability to local populations than some of the other places where the projects have not worked out. Why is this important? Some of the other projects that have moved forward, when the governments have not worked with local stakeholders, people have not been happy about it. And the projects, however far along they get, then it's too difficult, it's too expensive. There's maybe threat of nationalization. It looks quite bad at home, at your own democracy, when people see what kinds of work and what kinds of people you're working with abroad in order to get your resources. Also, Australia has really been a key partner, and that points to a larger point, or brings me to a larger point, that if we are pursuing resiliency and diversification and supply chains that are perhaps give some independence from China, or just alternatives, right? If something goes wrong, that it's important to find those in places that are resilient in other ways as well. They are resilient in ways of governance and human rights and environmental standards. In the research I did for this book, I looked at the geography of rare earths to see, could you do this? Is it even possible? Are we cursed with a geology such that rare earths are only in places that have terrible human rights records, no accountability for local politicians, no recourse if things go wrong? And that is resoundingly not the case. We can, in fact, get the resources we need from other places, places where that have more access to legal systems and access to protest, et cetera, and as well as having strong property rights regimes, for example, for companies to feel comfortable that the resources that they put in, the investments that they put in, will not be seized by the state. We do need to make the decision then in these places that we will mine, and that's a hard decision to make. To bring this back home, right at the end, over the last 18 months, so I'm at the University of Maine, over the last 18 months, there's been both a deposit of lithium and rare earths discovered in Maine. One is in the western mountains, one is in the far north in Aroostook County, if anyone's familiar with the geography. None of these are global market changing deposits, but they are, they have brought bursts of local excitement as well as fear. What will happen? Right? Will these resources be exploited? Will the natural beauty of the land be destroyed? Will the watersheds be polluted? Will we have any say of yes or no? Right now in local Maine law, those mines cannot be built, because we have very, very strong rules, but will the rules be changed? Is it worth it? These minerals are so important. Is that worth it? And that's a conversation that we are starting to have in Maine. And that speaks directly to, I say in my research, we need to like bring a lot of these responsibilities home to build real resilient supply chains. And now we'll have to do that in Maine. Thank you.
So mining keeps coming up. We tend not to like it. It also takes a lot of time. It's very, not only labor intensive, but it also requires many, many resources. I mean, financial resources. And there's only so much money to go around. It also raises questions of, is this transition and the way it's happening, is it worth it? It's so hard to ask this question. Also, I just want to point out, because the fossil fuel industry is also continuously being subsidized. And somehow we forget that because of this new challenge of the mining. I mean, we do have a chapter in the book where one of our scholars, Salim Ali, talks about the hazards or the potential of deep sea mining. And there are many conversations. Initially, I really thought this was very far into the future about space mining. In fact, as you'll see, this green transition has become a bonanza for every sector to become part of the solution to the climate crisis. And recently in Abu Dhabi, we have a new professor who's come in who teaches a class on the space economy. And she's Italian and she was head of the space agency in Italy. And we had a lovely conversation about the space economy. And as we are talking about it, I didn't know enough about it at all. And as we were talking about it, it became very, very clear that the space industry is putting itself smack right in the middle of the solution to the climate crisis. So for example, they're saying we will move infrastructures in space so that we release more land. So a lot of the monitoring will happen in space. Or this idea of space mining, which sounds fantastical, as in don't look up fantastical, seems though to be something where people are investing, and there's not only financial investment, but there's also technical, scientific investment and policy buy-in. So these are things that are all on the table. I just want everyone to think about it as we're attempting this transition. We'll talk a little bit also about the tech and the chip wars, because we did talk about the critical minerals as a source of contention globally as relations are heating up. And we've entered hyper competition as to who will be the winner in this transition. All the while, of course, we're saying that it has to be inclusive and equitable. So there are also these dilemmas that we're facing. But different countries, we heard a little bit about Japan and South Korea, are taking different kinds of approaches. Vasilios, not everyone is trying to, I've always claimed that Europe is doing a better job because they're trying to not decouple from China and weaponize interdependence. They're actually saying, at least theoretically, that they are trying to reconfigure supply chains or build new supply chains to create more of a resilience without excluding China. But tell us, what is the view from Europe? Because there's a lot being said. Europe said it would be the first climate neutral continent. There's a Green Deal that was announced in 2019. Where do we stand with respect to Europe?
Dr. Kalatzakos, thank you very much for the kind invitation to participate to the authoring of co-authoring of the book that you led in this great event. Thank you all for joining us in what evidently we think is the highest calling of humankind, rare earths. It's not just about Europe. Let's take a few steps back to fundamentals of public policy formation. In this case, industrial public policy for developing and empowering building technologies for the transition to net zero. Public policy formation, legislation, regulation is really not that different than the adding of component vectors in linear algebra. I'm sure you all remember that class from high school. Each stakeholder has their own vector, has their own need. It has its magnitude and it has its direction, and they rarely, look alike. But in the process of public policy decision-making, some vectors, some needs of stakeholders, in the case of critical raw material public policy making, automotive manufacturers, they had three needs, three vectors, each of its own magnitude and direction. The first one was that automotive manufacturers in Europe or North America, not that different. Let's try to compare both jurisdictions for the sake of an academic comparative analysis in this environment. They had three needs. The first one was to establish supply chain geographic optionality, ideally localization. The second one was to have, looking forward to the next speaker, the next speech of, to establish higher ESG standards because customers want it. My generation wants it more than anything. And then the third one was for automotive manufacturers in the transition from manufacturing internal combustion engine vehicles to electric vehicles, they wanted price volatility control of the critical raw materials with which they build them. So let's let's view this problem, this equation to solve through the eyes of policymakers. For the first problem of supply chain contours, of creating supply chains outside of evidently the one jurisdiction, very large jurisdiction, that apparently seems to have monopolies, in fact, even create choke points along the supply chain because they decided, to the evidence and point that Mr. Karayannopoulos made earlier, that it was their own industrial public policy priority 2.5 decades ago and become leaders in electric vehicle manufacturing, how the equivalent can be created in Europe and North America, the equivalent policies, and to create to be able to establish rapidly manufacturing facilities in the midstream that take ore, processed ore, beneficiated ore from mines, then separate it into individual, in our case, oxides, individual molecules, neodymium, praseodymium, terbium, dysprosium in our case, and then turn those individual oxides into specialty material like rare earth permanent magnets, which are needed. They are energy saving magnets. They are needed to reduce 20 to 30% in the case that Constantine was saying earlier of water circulation pumps. If you use rare earth permanent magnets, you save 20 to 30% of the energy needed for them. If you add 1 to 2 kilograms, 1 or 2 kilograms of rare earth permanent magnet in an electric vehicle, you save 20 to 30% because you make the engine more efficient of the battery that has orders of magnitude more of a need for critical raw materials in lithium, nickel, cobalt, graphite, manganese. So if you solve part of that problem by establishing midstream and downstream in, say, the case of Europe, you're able to to do it rapidly. You need CapEx, capital expense grants, support by the government. Here's what the challenge and the first comparison between Europe, the European Union at least, and the US. The EU's budget is 1/16 of that of the US's federal government. Problem number one. Problem number two is that the EU has a 7-year multi-year budget where the spending categories are already predetermined of the previous 7-year multi-year budgeting term. Problem number three is that there's more democracy. In Brussels, there's more members, there's 27 member states that have their own rights and they enforce their own rights and have more jurisdiction over a lot of legislation and regulation. So if Europe had to solve this issue quickly, clearly throwing money at the problem couldn't be the solution as much as anybody would want to. So in the US, you had the Inflation Reduction Act, and even in the US, by the way, in the case of rare earths, there wasn't enough political capital for using, say, funds from the Department of Energy. So it had to be a matter of national security because some rare earths are used for national security applications, although 98% of the market is driven going forward or 95% of the market going forward is driven by electric vehicle motors and offshore wind turbines. Apparently that wasn't cool enough, so they had to use funds, and now you're able to attract funds from the Department of Defense through the Title III process. And through that, you're able to get some CapEx support and build plants around rare earths in North America. In the case of Europe, where they couldn't throw money at the problem for the reasons that we described earlier, the European Commission decided to use the Brussels effect. It's what Professor Anu Bradford from the Columbia Law School calls the Brussels effect, which is the European Commission uses its regulatory superpower, the EU being the largest single common market in the world, to allow or prevent access to its market by raising standards, by using regulations. No coincidence, as it was announced, although this work had started last March, but it was announced a month ago. President von der Leyen, her State of the EU address, announced that there is an anti-subsidies investigation launched in the EU for electric vehicles manufactured in China and sold to Europe. This will trickle down to supply chains as well. So this is a first approach. The second approach, using its regulatory superpower, the EU Commission, was to go at the speed of necessity, at an unprecedented speed for Brussels, to establish the Critical Raw Materials Act and the Net Zero Industry Act. And in that, it does two major policy innovations, at least for the standards of the EU. The first one is that it tries to establish a timeline cap for decision-making for land use planning permits in the case of mining or establishing midstream, downstream facilities in the value chain of critical raw materials. The other innovation, or again, for Brussels standards, is that it establishes targets whereby, say, 2030 and then 2040, it's not just the emission reduction targets or the transition to electric vehicles from internal combustion vehicles. It also establishes targets along the value chain of critical raw materials to accomplish that. Specifically, it sets targets such as 20% of the molecules to manufacture critical components of electric vehicles need to be at least processed domestically and originate from recycled sources. And a series of other targets that I'll spare you from it unless you're very curious to continue on that. Then on the matter of ESG, it went forward last February, if I'm not mistaken, with the EU Sustainability Reporting Directive, which essentially mandates the sustainability reporting and tracing of supply chains for things such as human rights violations, good governance, social impact, community involvements, and of course, I guess the most measurable, environmental standards, or the easier to be measured standards. And then the third, which is how you are able to support in the control of a very volatile markets, or very volatile pricing of, in our case, rare earths, for example, where because at various stages in the value chain, there's a choke point in China, and therefore, when the Chinese government decides to increase or decrease quotas, so does the price go up and down rather, in a very volatile way, to be able to decouple from that, to establish outside of China supply chains. And because not everything can be done in one place, as Dr. Vekasi was saying earlier, the EU established partnerships with Vietnam, and so did the US, I believe, last week, strategic partnerships on critical raw materials, rare earths, lithium. Same goes with EU and Chile, Canada and the US, and so on. There's I believe, like 16 permutations and combinations of these bilateral partnerships between jurisdictions. And the reason for that is that the most that the EU could do, and to have the quickest, the fastest effect, or the effect in the fastest possible way, was to leverage its regulatory superpower, unlike the United States. And it has done that. It has done all this in a span of 2 years. And over the last 2 years, Constantine and I think we met over 60 folks in Brussels explaining exactly these things. A lot of that experience, I think, informed the book chapter.
So it's interesting. I mean, I've always said that Brussels will kill us with standards and regulations, but they kind of drag everybody on board. And this is what makes their kind of leadership particularly fascinating in this difficult time. So I want to say that we've talked a lot about rare earths, but there are other very important critical minerals, among which are lithium and cobalt. These are all very important for batteries, which is a different situation from the magnets where we need rare earths, and we need to separate them because there seems there's a tendency to throw everything in the same basket. But I think lithium and cobalt that are mined apart from Australia, but are mined in countries of the developing world, where I'm going to ask Owen to talk to us a lot about the ESG and the repercussions. They're very environmentally and socially disruptive, or potentially disruptive. We need a lot of them, 500% increase in the next couple of decades for what we need for batteries in order to electrify transport. So tell us a little bit about how we'll manage to do this kind of mining, but also minimize the catastrophic or the pressure, let's say, on societies.
So first of all, thank you very much for inviting me. Thank you so much for asking me to write the chapter. It was a lot of fun. It was interesting. I think that you've heard a lot of very broad propositions from the panel, and I guess I'll offer my own broad proposition. If you look at the history of technology, you look at the history of science, you look at the history of industrial development, you can't separate it from law. Law and economics are inextricably tied together. And it's funny about the vectors. You mentioned vectors. There's a pretty good argument, for example, that there was a time in this country when we were moving toward a lot of electric transportation, especially in city transportations, and a giant antitrust conspiracy led by the auto industry and the rubber tire industry completely destroyed all of that electrified transportation. And 30 years later, after the Department of Justice proved the conspiracy, you couldn't go back and undo all the damage that had been done. And so now we have all these gas-powered buses that we now have to switch over to electric batteries. And as to space exploration, another interesting example. Why is space exploration so inviting now? In part because of the lack of a legal regime up in space. Industry loves a vacuum, and because it lowers cost. So let's go where the costs are cheap and we can do anything we want and damage as many things potentially as we want until law catches up. So I think what the history of technology and the history of industry teaches is that there is always going to be a give and take. There's always going to be a surge or a lack of surge where law will sometimes lead and law will sometimes catch up. In addition, when one talks about the role of government, you've heard a lot here about subsidy and about governments, whether through taxation policy or direct subsidy, encouraging or not encouraging. Another way that government can shape economy is by the simple use of law. Because law can create efficiency, can reduce efficiency, can create opportunity. So what's interesting about Latin America, and lithium mining especially, is that Latin American lithium mining presents a really interesting real-time lab experiment into how law could help mature, in effect, the problems of our WTO-driven system. China became the world's workshop because the WTO system encouraged that actively. And one of the problems we found, and we thought what would happen is that China would develop, people would get richer there, they would demand more human rights, they would get more human rights, and everything would be rosy. And everyone would get, wax lips and Twix bars and Reese's peanut butter cups like it was Halloween, and life would be great. And then that didn't happen. Economic interdependence did not do away with war. We thought we might have learned that with what happened with World War I, but I guess we didn't. So economic interdependence did not make war impossible for countries to wage. And the cheapest cost provider model that China took perfectly logical advantage of led to repercussions. And some of those repercussions related to human and social rights and even economic issues. So now where are we? Now we're starting to see a second phase. And I think what you're really seeing around the world is a second phase in terms of how do we mature global trade and globalization to lead to more efficient responses that take into account a broader array of issues. And that's a really interesting, challenging problem. So Latin America with lithium mining is the perfect lab experiment. And the reason for that is that Latin America, although it doesn't have all the lithium in the world, what it does have is probably at least 80% of the lithium that you extract through brining, where you take the dirt, you put it in water, you soak it and evaporate it for a while. That makes a concentrated slurry. And I know I'm grossly oversimplifying. And then you basically move this water with the lithium in it, with lithium deposits in it, through a series of evaporation ponds. And you eventually get something that you can then refine to get usable lithium. And at least based on what we see in Chile, it takes 500,000 gallons of water to get 1 ton of lithium. And that seems to be what people expect to be a relative standard in the industry. So 500,000 gallons of water to get 1 ton of lithium. So you can see how this will involve billions and billions of gallons of water very quickly. Maybe, I don't know how it compares to fracking, but it can't be good. And what's interesting about it is the areas in the lithium triangle are semi-arid. They are either salt flats or they are wetlands. They are in a semi-arid area that is not getting any wetter as global warming occurs. And so they have a groundwater issue. If you pump out a lot of the groundwater for use in lithium extraction, you're going to pose a problem vis-a-vis the indigenous peoples who live on this land, the animals and migratory birds and other things that live on this land. There's going to be a biodiversity problem. There's going to be a people problem. There's going to be a land use problem. And there's going to be a significant issue of water management, pollution management, severe resilience issues. What's going to be left when we've gotten the lithium out? And price volatility is an interesting issue. I mean, the World Bank has warned that price volatility in the lithium market could create real strains on how the mining is financed and how the land use is managed. So we've got this really interesting situation where we have these countries that now have mineable lithium. We know we've got an issue with environmental issues that roll over into biodiversity and social issues, especially as to indigenous peoples. The other unique thing that you don't have everywhere in the world is Latin America entered into an agreement in 2018 called the Escazú Agreement, which not a lot of people paid attention to, but it was interesting because it was sort of a first. What the Escazú Agreement does, and it's now in full operation because 24 countries signed it and more than 11 have now ratified it, so it's now operational. The Escazú Agreement says that all the countries in Latin America, Latin and Central America, are supposed to create systems, governmental systems that will allow populations to understand environmental decision-making. So there's got to be a lot more information gathered. There's got to be a lot more information made available, which is interesting. It affirms environmental rights that have already been recognized by the Inter-American Human Rights Court as seminal human rights relating to the environment and indigenous peoples. But then what it does is it says, and by the way, you have to give real access to not-for-profits, to NGOs. They have to have the ability to get access to all this information and to have access to justice to challenge decisions, including decisions about environmental damage, environmental hazard, environmental degradation. And it is a unique international convention in that it became the first international convention to say, as a blanket matter, states must take concrete steps to protect environmental defenders. This is now state obligation. And the treaty mandates that that Latin American states now have to put in place laws to carry out these rights. And that's going to actually be interesting. I would predict that one of the first places you're going to start seeing the Escazú Agreement affect things is, I bet, in commercial and investor state arbitrations in Latin America relating to things like lithium mining. You're going to start seeing people trying to use the treaty to create enforceable rights and arbitrations. Because Latin American countries have obligations now. They've signed on to do certain things. So you've got lithium on the one hand, you've got the Escazú Agreement creating a rights structure that really doesn't exist in other places, and now you've got the EU ESGs. So the reason the EU is interesting is because it's way ahead of everyone else in the world. It has actually gone so far as to create a real system where you can look at ESGs in a new way. And the new way and this goes to something the panel has talked about. You've heard a lot about government subsidy, but in fact, the EU has recognized that no amount of money that governments can mobilize can actually fund climate change adaptation and climate change needs. Government doesn't have enough money. There is enough money in all the budgets in all the world to fund it. There's only one place where there's enough money, and that's the private sector. And so what the European Union has said is, okay, let's do what we've now had securities regulation in the world since the Great Depression. We know 90 years. In 90 years, we've seen that a disclosure-based system where people looking for money are forced to disclose information in order to get money, whether by loan or by equity. And that's enforceable by law, and you get in trouble if you don't disclose enough, and investors are empowered to ask questions. What have we seen? There's a pretty good argument that a disclosure-driven system has created massive value. And it has mobilized money. It makes money move faster. Over time, it arguably makes money move more efficiently. And it creates more ability to challenge and process more information faster than governments can ever hope to. And I think you could make a pretty good argument that it may fuel innovation, although I know there's a lot of debate around that. And probably the correct answer is there needs to be a healthy balance between government subsidy and government investment in certain kinds of things and an information-driven disclosure system. But the bottom line is the EU is basically recognized, and it's an interesting thing because this is an American thing that the Americans were the ones who created disclosure-driven securities markets. The EU has embraced this. And the EU has said this is the only way we're ever going to mobilize for climate change. So that's interesting. The second thing that's interesting is the EU has said, but now we need to change certain things about disclosure. And this is where it gets funny. This is where it gets really interesting. So the first thing the EU has said is we need to change perspective. The American model that everyone has embraced elevates the short term over the long term. Business managers in business school are taught you focus on financially material information, which is generally information 12 to 36 months old, and that relates to information the company knows and creates itself and is audited by auditors about. And it has to do with information that any reasonable investor would find useful in making a buy, hold, or sell decision, period, full stop. The problem is we don't value long-term data. We don't value long-term outcome, or we don't do it well. And if you wanted a live example of this, look back a few years at the scandal over how oil companies used to report their reserves before the regulators changed how they report their reserves, because they routinely used to manipulate their reserve numbers, which were very long-term. They used to manipulate their reserve numbers to move the short-term prices of their shares. And finally, the regulator said, okay, we're not going to do that anymore. And the market got more efficient. So what the EU is saying is, we are now going to change what you have to disclose to your investors. And we're also, interestingly, going to force investors like banks and pension funds and insurance companies to analyze and release information on what they're investing in and the ESG profiles of those investments, which is interesting. That's a unique aspect of what the Europeans are doing. And I would argue that it's a way of jump-starting this process, making it move faster. But where you end up is this. In the EU, you're now going to have to look at, and this is already in place, this is coming in 2024, it's going to start phasing it. You're going to have to look at 6 environmental factors, of which one is pollution mitigation, biodiversity. You're going to have to look at social factors. Your social factors have to do with workers, communities, and customers. But what you're also looking for is to what extent does your business impact those constituencies? And the impact would include as to pollution, as to reduction of biodiversity, as to making it less likely these people will have peaceful and inclusive societies, et cetera. But what's the twist? The twist is a really interesting twist. The EU decided against telling corporate directors, you owe duties to these other communities. You don't. The EU, again, I think they did the smart thing. They said, you still owe your duties to only one group, shareholders. Shareholder wealth maximization, the holy grail of securities investing. They said, you owe your shareholders wealth maximization, but what we're telling you is whether you're doing it well or not is now going to have to involve long-term data and real disclosure as to how much your business is exposed to not being resilient to long-term risk. And they've created a new idea as to materiality, and that's called double materiality, which is good and confusing. Double materiality says, on the one hand, you've got standard financial materiality, but now you have to look at impact materiality, which is that businesses have to look at non-financial information, and they have to decide, looking over the long term, what things that are not material today may become material in the long term, things that have the potential to become material. And as a governance matter, auditors are now going to have to look at how you disclose what systems do I have in place to identify long-term risks, which has never been something auditors looked at. And now they're going to have to, and businesses are going to have to describe that. So what's interesting is, based on the breadth of the EU legislation, which includes companies and all their subsidiaries and affiliates, which includes banks and all of bank subsidiaries and affiliates, which includes not only your subsidiaries and affiliates, but your value chain. So now you're making disclosures as to people in your value chain who aren't even part of your corporate family as to their impacts. This is going to be just so much fun. The lawyers are going to make so much money out of it. It's amazing. And that's a good thing. I mean, I'm retired, but it's a good thing. So the point is, and the auditors are going to have a really interesting time. It is fascinating that business schools are not yet teaching to this on long-term risk and resilience analysis. That's a little troubling, but okay. So how does this relate to Latin America? It's going to be very hard for Latin American lithium mining to avoid this, whether on the money side or on the mining side or both. And the other thing to remember is, even if you somehow are doing something in Latin America and you don't think the European ESG structure covers you, remember that I would dare you to think about any investor anywhere in the world who, when that investor hears that somebody else is getting information that's broader than the information they're getting, that they sit by and take that lightly. As soon as the Europeans start demanding better disclosure, American investors with a lot of money are going to start demanding the same disclosure. You'd be crazy not to, because everything you've ever learned about disclosure is that disclosure equals value. That if you want to make better return, if you want to find the arbitrage, if you want to find the market, you need more information. And if someone's getting more information than you're getting a bad deal. And so what you will find is that people like Vanguard and Fidelity and BlackRock and Blackstone are already starting to build in European type standards to what they're telling companies they're going to have to disclose, even though they're in the United States and they're not subject to the EU regulations, because that's going to become the gold standard. And that's really interesting. So Latin America creates a really interesting test lab on the issue of long-term risk. And the reason I was interested in this is that I'm the president of an NGO that is the largest NGO in the world for training government officials in how to prevent genocide and mass atrocity outbreaks. And one of the things that we know in our market is that, in fact, long-term predictability can work. That databases that look back 150 years in a multivariate analysis can actually tell you that over the next 36 months, where are the 15 countries most likely to have genocide and mass atrocity outbreaks. That can be done, and it can be done with not a bad level of efficiency. And governments use that for foreign policy decision-making. So what's interesting is we can do long-term. Corporate managers will hate this. They will hate it. I mean, just see some corporate managers sitting here, you're going to hate this. They're going to hate this. They're not trained to do it. It's going to, how does it affect your bonus? It's not good, right? It's a lot more to analyze. It's a lot more to think about. Corporate managers will hate this. But the fact is, it can be done. It's not undoable. And so anybody who tells you this isn't doable, this isn't feasible, that's not true. It's hard, but it's certainly feasible. So what this tells you about lithium mining in Latin America is that probably, I think, what I wrote in my chapter is, I think it's an invitation to, for example, the Canadian model of having an ombudsman, having the government create a neutral to begin intermediating on the issue of free, prior, and informed consent by Indigenous communities on what do they want long-term. The issue of property rights. How do you deal with Indigenous communities that don't have property rights? They don't believe in them. They have as a matter of tribal matters, everything's communal. They don't have deeds to all that semi-arid land that's sitting out there with lithium in it. but they've been on that land for hundreds of years and they depend on it. I think government is going to have to create process to allow for these economic decisions to get worked out. But I think that investors are going to start asking harder questions. And to your point about recycling, I think that's going to factor into how you ask questions of how do you inject money into this process. But to your point, if done correctly, I would argue that ultimately, by asking harder questions about what the long term should look like, we will get more innovation. We will maybe get better, we will get different approaches to mining. We will get different approaches to how you extract. We will get different approaches to how you run the supply chain. Because as the market elongates the economic channel, how the money flows through that channel is going to change. That's how a hose works. And that's what we haven't seen yet. But Latin America is a unique opportunity for this because of these way these factors hook together.
Okay, I think you guys have gotten a little bit a taste of this road to net zero. It's not a simple road. Nothing is exactly as it seems. It's difficult, it's complicated. It involves, I mean, we tackled the issue of critical minerals and their role as part of the solution as our response to the climate crisis. We have similar questions with regard to technology. We can talk about this, but things that are coming out of this conversation is regulation is going to play a role, standards are going to play a role. Many areas that may not have been, I would say, appealing, such as nobody cared about supply chains. Now people are really interested in how they work. And it's actually kind of, it is interesting in and of itself, but it was considered boring. Now we're going to have disclosure, which I would have probably fallen asleep.
Yeah, now it's like
But
Wide
now-
World of Sports. Now it's like ESPN.
these things are also playing a role in the you know, the devil's in the details. So I don't want us to keep going on. I want to ask the audience if you have questions for us. We've talked a lot about the geopolitical situation. We've talked about how the United States is approaching the transition. In some ways, Asia, other countries, important industrial nations in Asia. The reality was that China didn't, according to Constantine, China had a plan, but it didn't mean that it had a plan to stick it to everybody else. It had a plan to develop its economy. And given the competitive nature of trade, it turned out that China was very forward thinking, managed to really upgrade its position in specific markets. And now, of course, this has become a source of contention as China has become a superpower. This is fueling the current Sino-American, I guess, competition. If I'm not calling it a war, it's not a war. Yes.
One of the really interesting things I see when looking at Chinese industrial policy towards rare earths is that if you compare what China did starting in the 1980s, moving through and developing this really strong, robust rare earth industry, they have strong comparative advantage along the supply chain. It's very impressive that a lot of those policy lessons of what they did were the things that the United States did in the 1950s and 60s to develop our rare earth industry. And we did it really well. And then we stopped doing it. And we lost comparative advantage in some of those things. And some of that was market forces. And some of that was we stopped funding the PhD programs. We stopped having the sort of building this industry education pipeline and information exchange, some things that China started doing really well. And so we often hear in the United States that this was a plan and that we should treat it in a strategic way because it was a plan that we need to respond to. But also we could be like, hey, let's build some more PhD programs. Let's start building expertise. Let's go back to what we did really well 80 years ago and try and do that again. And that will have all sorts of great trickle down effects for education, for technology, for vibrancy that are separate from these really negative sort of Cold War kinds of feelings.
Sophia, can I just amplify the China point there?
And
So,
then I saw
just
there's a
briefly.
question, and I want Constantine to talk about Europe and NEO in Europe, because this is interesting, since you mentioned the 80 years of previous industrial policy of the United States.
So just on the idea that China had a grand plan and had everything figured out, it's that we once had a discussion at my law firm where we brought in a group of Chinese bankers, and we brought them in to speak to some people from the World Bank. And the discussion was around something called the Equator Principles, which were an early idea of you don't make loans for big project finance deals unless there are going to be certain human rights and environmental treaty rights recognized and carried out on the project. And the World Bank people said to the Chinese bankers, have you ever seen an Equator Principle project canceled because the builder, the sponsor, stops meeting their requirements to abide by all these different treaties and remediate pollution and do all these things? And the Chinese said, no. And the World Bank guy said, so it failed. And the Chinese guy said, you don't really understand much about credit risk management, do you? And the World Bank says, well, I don't make loans. I just give money away. So no, I don't understand how loans work. And the Chinese guy said, interesting. Chinese bankers as a group said, we have learned from our experiences in China that better human rights and environmental management of projects leads to a better likelihood that the loan will be repaid. And that bad compliance and that bad environmental policy and lack of environmental resilience over time makes it more likely that loans default. And so here you had a group of Chinese bankers basically saying, we've learned our lesson. And so what they said is, if we see a sponsor not meeting their requirements, we don't have to call a default. We just have to wait 6 months. They'll be in default anyway. It becomes the canary in the coal mine. And so interestingly, you had Chinese bankers saying, over the long run, we're going to lose bushels of money on projects where we didn't have good environmental infrastructure and good social policy infrastructure. And now we're looking to make that more of our loan documentation because in the long run, we get paid back better.
Today we spoke a lot about like the control and the supply chain of the rare earth minerals, but what is the likelihood that China and other people that have a comparative advantage share the intellectual, like the technologies that actually produce the more energy efficient or energy creation like machines to other industrial nations rather than just sharing the actual materials to make those technologies? Like, if their objective is to develop their economy, what is the likelihood of China actually exporting wind turbines or other green energy like machines to Western nations for their own use and ultimately the greening of the energy industry?
Sure. Well, I think there's a little bit of a disconnect in terms of what we understand to be the comparative advantages of technologies and companies in China. So without sort of speaking ad infinitum, I think we have some fundamental basic tenets that I think you absolutely touched on, Owen. And Chinese investment, government investment has been over the long term. Chinese planners are thinking in 50-year terms. And this is where our massive disadvantage comes. As a CEO of a public company, I live and die by my share price. Every quarter, I have to have my earnings call with my shareholders. And if my share price is down and my costs are up, my prices are down, I get roasted and fired even. It happens to a lot of CEOs. So we talked a little bit about cycle times, and we need to take into account in the West the cycle times in terms of public companies and how we function. I mean, I'm looking quarter to quarter, year over year perhaps, but I'm not looking 5, 10, 20 years down the road because I'm not going to be in that job. So at the same time, the project development timeline does not fit with the election cycle. So if you make a decision to give $500 million to a project today, That's not going to be in production for another 10 years, as Kristin said. So it'll be another government that will reap the benefits or pay the price. So I think we need to come to terms with cycle times, and perhaps we need to also take into account a brilliant statement by Larry Fink, the BlackRock CEO, during one of his environmental conferences, because I was there, I listened to it, and he said, well, the job of the CEO is to make money, and the job of government is to save the world, save capitalism from the capitalists. So, there's a lot of things that need to be done here. And you also touched on another thing, which is about the Chinese have learned their lessons. In my 30 years going back and forth to China and building plants in China and having customers and so on, is that I've never come across a group of people that are better students of history and people who learn from their mistakes. I've seen government folks and business folks make a lot of mistakes, but I've never seen them make the same mistake twice. So they study they know what happened in the Congo in the 50s and the 60s. Yeah, but then they don't make the same mistake again, though. So, resource imperialism, I mean, come on, who wrote the book on this stuff? And they're learning from the best. So instead of getting into, really long discussions here, specifically on IP, today, the technology to extract, refine, and utilize rare earths exists in the West. The best equipment and the most efficient equipment is made in China still. Like one of my customers from Japan built a plant in Vietnam to make rare earth magnets. All the furnaces and all the equipment came from China. That's a fact of life. But what this it wasn't patented technology, it was furnaces, vacuum induction furnaces, and coating and slicing equipment. So what I'm trying to say, I guess, if we had to do it all over again, the technology exists in the West to do it. It'll probably be a bit more expensive and perhaps a little bit less efficient than the Chinese state of the art. Because again, when you see a Japanese company building a factory with Chinese equipment in Vietnam, you know where this is all going. But can it be done? Yes, absolutely, it can be done. It'll be a bit more expensive. And then we all have to make a decision. You see, I had all these conversations over the decades in Japan with, I don't know how many people have dealt with Japanese business folks. You sit across the table and they say, Constantine-san, please build a rare earth factory outside of China. I said, okay, great, but it'll cost you 10% more. And they all suck air through their teeth and said, no, that's impossible. We can't do it. Well, that's what it will take. And that's, I think, the realization we're coming to. If we want to do things a certain way, it will be a bit more expensive. And when we talked about subsidies earlier about China, I mean, look at the successful examples that exist in terms of critical material project or rare earth projects. Kristin referred to them. Linus in Japan, they were bailed out by the government of Japan. Linus in Australia was bailed out by the government of Japan. And this $250 million loan, which of course allowed them to go over the hump, and now they're fine. There hasn't been another successful project that I'm familiar with other than Serra Verde in Brazil, which was developed with private equity money. And they're trying to go public eventually. But there are not that many examples. And again, because all these projects compete in a global market against Chinese multinationals, some of whom are state-owned enterprises. Some folks would argue that all Chinese companies are state-owned enterprises, but that's beside the point. But you are competing, Linus is competing against a system that over the decades, it had massive investment in technology development, supply chain development, and perhaps more importantly, and this is something that we're not paying attention in the West, and I could talk about that with regards to Europe over drinks, perhaps. In China, in the 90s, and it's orders of magnitude better now, but in the 90s, I could hire rare earth engineers right out of school, rare earth chemists, and I'd put them in my plants and they would be immediately productive. In North America, you can't find people that would recognize where rare earths are in the periodic table. But graduates in North America can not even find their own countries on the map, but that's beside the point.
He's being facetious. Okay, we can take one question and then let's discuss downstairs because I think they want us to wrap up.
I'll be quick. So there's one rare earth manufacturer in the United States, and that's MP Materials. And they're 9% owned by China, but they're very much controlled by China. They, up until a few years ago, they had to ship everything to China. Now they still have to because China still does the processing till they eventually come up with their processing. How does the United States let that happen? The only place I've seen it written up is when people are trying to short the stock. Then they kill MP and they talk about the 9%. But how does the US keep throwing money at a company kind of controlled by China?
I think it's pretty.
Wait, we cannot speak to this because,
No,
you
I mean,
can't, and
there's
I
a
can't.
logical answer to it.
no, but wait.
There was a
because-
belief. There was a belief in the WTO system. They were approving those deals, and there was a belief in the WTO system, and that was the foreign policy of the United States. I'm sure it went through CFIUS review. I'm sure it got approved.
I want to say that we can't speak to this, although we've written about this, but Constantine can really speak about it because when this company went through various renditions. It went bankrupt before it went bankrupt in the huh? No, 20, that's the second time they went bankrupt. Okay.
They didn't go bankrupt.
In 2000, they closed because they lost the competitive edge to China and for environmental regulation reasons.
Although the EPA shut it down.
The EPA shut them down for environmental regulation reasons. And so then the company was resurrected again and really became heavily invested in, I would say, around the time when rare earths peaked because of the incident with Japan. And then, and this is where it gets interesting, as Owen would say, and this is very interesting now. So as the company grew in value and the stock price went through the roof, the CEO expanded the company further and came and bought Constantine's company. And so NEO became part of Molycorp. And then the prices collapsed and the company was completely overextended. I'm oversimplifying now. And it went bankrupt again. And then it went through a period of restructuring in which Constantine, Oaktree came in and decoupled the mine from NEO. And NEO became, which was the most, I guess, profitable section of the company. And then, so NEO broke away. So if you want to ask about the whole story of Molycorp and MP Materials, I think Constantine can really give you like the insider view about it. But what's important is that the mine is back in business. And I think that given the geopolitical situation and, under Trump especially, and continuing under Biden, the US policy has been to decouple from China as much as possible and to produce rare earths in the United States. Yes, China, a Chinese company has a stake in MP. Yes, the materials are sent to China to be processed, to be refined because they could not do that in the United States. MP has gotten a number of DoD contracts. I mean, there are a lot of specifics about the particular mine itself. But there is this idea that the United States was letting the market take care of things. And unless it was tied to national security, it did not believe, after the change that Kristin was describing before, it did not believe in having this kind of government policy for industry. It's always very tricky in America. Japan is much more open about doing that. Korea is very much open. The EU is doing industrial policy through standards and its regulatory power because of all of the nations that comprise the EU. So I think it's a really interesting example of how different jurisdictions do things differently. So let's all go down. Thank you so much for being with us. For more questions, we'll all be downstairs. Thank you.